Well, I want to kind of dive in now into your business with COOP Ale Works. How did you all get started with this business? How did this come about?
Poor decisions and lots of circumstances. Generally, how I answer that question. No, but there were three of us that started the brewery, and we all met in early 2006 in April or so, and really just again happenstance that we ran into each other through some social connections and forums. And one of the guys that we started the brewery with was a home brewer, and he had been homebrewing for 3 or 4 years at that point, and was talking about, in this first encounter I had with him, just about the prospect of starting a brewery in Oklahoma. And so that folded into my background in the venture space and the finance space. And at the time I was with I2E as director of enterprise services there. And I had spent 5 years prior to I2E in the venture space, and it just was intriguing to me. And with my background with fundraising, we started talking, and within a few weeks we set up some kind of low-key beer tastings in the back room of Cheevers. And that was really the first encounter, was that we had collected people to kind of explore this idea and pick people's brains about what they were drinking back in 2006 in Oklahoma, because it was a lot different than what people were drinking on the coast or what people were drinking, internationally. And so we were really interested in whether there was a receptive audience to craft beer that really didn't exist at the time, and especially with our pretty prohibitive alcohol laws as far as 3.2 beer and the lack of availability of beer in grocery and convenience. And so we started exploring that. We worked through the summer. We started brewing together in August, and then we spent the next basically 2 years putting together plans and going to dozens of breweries around the United States, sitting down with engineers and brewers and financial people to try to investigate their methods of success and their histories, and build a baseline strategy to kind of kick COOP off, which we did in the summer of 2008. And is when we raised the initial capital, found our building, and then we spent about 6 months building out this little 5,000 square foot metal shack over at 51st and Western next to the old Speakeasy Bar. And then we started brewing beer commercially on January 9th in 2009 and selling on March 3rd of 2009. So
Been doing this for quite a while now.
it's been a while now, yeah, over a decade.
So, talking a little bit about more you specifically in your role, what's your day-to-day like? What's your job like?
It's pretty broad. I like to generally respond by just telling people that I steer the ship, and that's really at the 35,000 foot view. That's the objective right now. But if you back up in our history, I was a small partner in the business, and then as we had partners move away from the business, obviously in the company grew and our distribution footprint grew. And our growth just became this overwhelming focal point. And so as I've become a larger and larger, participant actively in the business, when I quit my day job, particularly in February of 2012, started along the road of growing the business regionally. And it became very quickly apparent that over the next 3 or 4 years, what we needed here was a leadership team that could adequately lead individual departments or silos or functions within the organization. Because for a long time, I was the accountant, and I was the legal guy, and I was the regulatory guy, and I was doing bonuses here and setting sales objectives. And that kind of broad management is just not sustainable. And so over the past 5 years, essentially, Blake Jarlem, our head brewer, who's also a partner, has been on board with us since very early on in 2009 on a part-time basis, and then 2010 when he came full-time. But for a long time in the teens, Blake and I were the only ones here. But now we have a director of sales and marketing, we have an HR director, and then we've got Blake running the operations. And so collectively now we have a management team that is capable of managing individual silos and autonomously, really running those divisions of the business. And so my functional role at this point is mostly strategic. At times I'm fairly technically involved. Depends on what we're doing in the back, but most of that technical involvement is around expansion, new equipment, speccing parts or systems that we're adding into the matrix, trying to figure out, what new canning line do we want, to increase our canning capacity tenfold, things like that. But even so, with that particular component, like the technical side, I'm really passionate about. But again, we now have staff on board that are, fairly technically competent and have some really technical manufacturing backgrounds. So that's good. And really, to get to the core of your question, right now and for the past year and a half, I spend about 90% of my time working on the armory expansion.
I want to talk a little bit about setting up the management team and all the silos for like new entrepreneurs. Like, what advice would you share to like those on the hiring process?
Sure. I think for me, it started as an objective to bring talent in that was good at things I was not good at. I'm good at a certain number of skill sets, but I can't sell anything. And, running HR programs and benefits and, things like that, it's not where my strong suits are. And I'm definitely not a brewer, just to clarify that. But we wanted to bring talent in that could adequately and autonomously run those divisions. And so from a hiring standpoint and really even a conceptual objective, the first thing for me and our group collectively as we've grown has always been to hire talent that's smarter than we are, obviously in those specific channels, and also hire people who are going the same direction we're going. And that's been probably the biggest focal point over the past 5 years, because on our team right now, we have 29 people. We operate in 6 states, and we have a total sum of 2 people on staff who have been here longer than 5 years, myself and Blake. And so you can think about that either in a positive light or a negative light, but really in a positive light, it's the fact that, over time companies have attrition, but what we've been really successful at is defining the company's objectives, and in the hiring process, ensuring that we're absolutely transparent with where the company is going and where we want people to fit in that matrix. And if people don't, if they don't want to go where we're going, then we don't want them here, frankly. And the second aspect of hiring is kind of the subsequent step, and that's investing in people. And so the family and the team that we built here is probably the thing that I'm most proud of over the past 5 or 6 years. The brand is great and has all these positive elements to it in the community and elsewhere, but the people and our team here are really what functionally make this business turn every day.
You did mention this, and I was going to ask this because I know you're not a brewer yourself. You're more the business person. So what have been like the pros and cons of that?
The pros are, early on, even from day one back in 2006 when Mark and J.D. and I met, one of my, kind of tidbits and inputs was that we really had the opportunity in the research phase to set a foundation for how we wanted to move forward and how diligent we wanted to be and how we really wanted to run this thing. I mean, we were starting a brewery from scratch in a market that really didn't have a production brewery outside of brewpubs, which aren't packaging breweries. And so in doing so, with my business background in particular on the finance side and on the growth side, I wanted to ensure that we approach the business as a business and not as a hobby, because so many brewers, and frankly, the super majority of them, I would argue 90+% of them, started as hobbies like ours did, and then grew into this passion for the hobby. And we had a passion for it, but for myself in particular, I've got a certain drive around the business and the mechanics and the fundamentals of ensuring that we are creating something sustainable. And so as we've grown, focusing on the business has made me, and having a business background, frankly, has made me a little bit of an outsider in the brewing community. And so when you generally go, say, to an industry event where 99% of the brewers there or the owners were brewers, it's a little bit different of a scenario here. And so I would say the only real negative has been really isolated to me personally, in that I don't get as much connection with the brewers, and I'm not received as well into the group. And so in some instances, I'm almost like an outsider in brewing circles, I also kept a very low profile for the first 7-8 years of this endeavor. And as we had the original 2 founders exit the company and I became, kind of the single responsible founder, it just kind of necessitated that I take a larger fronting role in the company visually and publicly. And so that was a little bit of an adaptation that I had to get used to. But the positives to running this thing like a business and not a hobby, and that's not to say that other brewers don't run their companies like businesses, but really, we focus on some really core business fundamentals. We hire our staff with that in mind, and we look for people who can add value to the business and not necessarily to beverage. I mean, if you want to come in here, and we hired a data analyst about a year and a half ago, and this was a role that I'd wanted to have in the business for several years, but we couldn't afford the position. We didn't really know exactly how the role would pan out. But this is a function in our business that gleans us just a treasure trove of information and valuable data and decision points, and allows us to make better decisions so that we can exercise more creativity because we have more capital, because we're more efficient here, or we're making mistakes sooner than we should because we are looking at other breweries to find out how they've screwed things up or how they've done things well, and trying to look at those decision points and make our evolution smarter, frankly. And in a manufacturing business, particularly in beer, in a community that's very altruistic and just very passion driven, the business component for us and the level of acumen that we have on our teams here internally is very rare, I think, in the brewery business.
So you mentioned, what were some of those data points that when you hired this person, they found was like, I didn't realize that would be useful, or that was just, oh, that's fascinating?
Sure. We have a number of systems internally that we use for financial purposes, that we use for production efficiency tracking, things like that all really dovetail into each other, and they're disparate yet connected. And so I've made it a point over the past decade to ensure that our accounting technical processes are in line and that we have made the right decisions very early on. And we've always had this mindset of collecting data, but we've never really had the capacity or the time to sit down and extract value out of it. And so that's really where the position was, that's where we wanted that position to focus. We knew, though, bringing someone in to fulfill that role, it would take a year for them to really understand the nuts and bolts of the business. And there have been a lot of short-term tasks over the past year and a half, but really now we're getting into the point where, hey, we've got all this data. We're pulling sales data out of Ecos or out of syncing systems from all of our distributors in 6 states on a daily basis, and we can see velocity movements in individual stores now. And we know that the Homeland on 18th and Classen is moving X volume per day, and we know when there are gaps in the market. We know how to better manage our inventory and our production, and we can back into really ensuring that our product stability is better and that the throughput on the shelves and the velocity is where we're targeting, or it's not, and we can see detrimental impacts to the brand or to sales movement, things like that, and then ultimately start making better production, sales, and investment decisions with that data.
Kind of want to get into the Oklahoma Venture Forum. In April, you're going to be speaking there, but before we kind of talk about your presentation, what you're going to be talking about, why do you think people should join the Venture Forum?
So for a number of reasons, I think. I've been exposed to the OVF for, almost 20 years now, and started going in 2001. So I've seen it for quite a while. I was in the industry and kind of in that realm for about 7 years, and then I left Oklahoma. And when I came back, I went into more of an institutional finance role, and really haven't participated much. But I can tell you, having spent about 7 years of exposure in the startup community, that OVF is where some of the brightest minds and some of the most tenured entrepreneurs have spent a lot of their time and a lot of their reinvestment and or kind of philanthropic contribution to the startup community. And it also gives you pretty direct exposure to a knowledge base and resources that aren't really highly publicized in Oklahoma, and frankly anywhere a lot of times. And really a lot of those revolve around sources of capital and strategery and consulting input and things like that. So I think the value of OVF is the mix of people that are there and the learning opportunities, and really, again, the base of knowledge that exists amongst Oklahoma entrepreneurs as well as financiers.
So since you got the talk in April, can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking and presenting about?
Sure. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the Armory as, a current event, obviously, and something where we've spent a lot of time and resources over the past couple of years, and where is going to consume a lot of our time over the next couple of years, and also create a massive impact here in the city around the state capitol complex, the northeast side of Oklahoma City. But I really want to talk about brewing and the beer industry in general as a really kind of an outlier from a fundraising perspective. And, we spend a lot of time talking about diversifying industry in Oklahoma, and a lot of that talk is around either high impact or high level concept industries, whether it's biomedical research or, autoimmune disease treatment or, mechanical devices, things centered around the oil and gas industry that may be new technologies and hardware technologies. But there are also plenty of other industries that just aren't near as sexy, frankly. And I think in Oklahoma in particular, we've done a great job of focusing on our resources that we have, particularly around the OU Health Science Center, around the oil and gas base that exists here, and all the new technologies that have sprung out of that industry over the past, say, 20 years. And you see evidence of that littered throughout Oklahoma City. The new GE, the Baker Hughes Research Facility, obviously the PHF, OMRF, and all the research institutes, and kind of privatization of technology and things that are coming out of the university research arenas. But there are still a lot of other industries that get ignored and or just don't get as much, just aren't as well known, and there are lots of investment opportunities, and frankly the need for investment and the number of resources available to entrepreneurs that exist in those kind of non-sexy industries is extremely high, and it's harder to break into that network of seed capital. And entities like OCAST and I2E have done a great job in these scientific frontiers and technological frontiers, but there are a lot of opportunities for seed capital funds, I think, and I say funds not as in individual organizations, but just as in money and dollars flowing in. There's a lot of opportunity out there for either investors to bring money in, and also an opportunity for entrepreneurs to start to drive focus around their industries in particular. So for us, we're 12 years old, and every time we've gone to raise money and or expand, it's always been this kind of nightmare scenario where we're the first ones doing this thing in this industry in Oklahoma. And it's been challenging almost every single time, whether it was when we launched the business and we were trying to find a little bit of equity and a little bit of debt, and everybody on the debt side looking at us like we were nuts because there wasn't a brewery in Oklahoma, and what bank is going to loan money?
I remember reading an article that I believe it was Steve Lackemeyer did about that, and you were saying that exact same thing. Like, there was back then when you first started out, there was like no bank that wanted to give you money, and now there's some kind of knocking down your door.
Yeah, sure. And the Armory, frankly, is this really, really, really cool project that's going to have a massive footprint, not only geographically there on that site, but also an economic impact that is really unlike anything the northeast side of Oklahoma City has really ever seen. And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of economic impact. Well, yeah, it all sounds fine and dandy, and all the banks are interested. But once you get into the core of it, we're taking this brewery model and we're expanding it and adding other new businesses to our model that put us right back in the same boat that we were in 10, 12 years ago, because we're getting into the hotel business, or we're getting into this culinary business that involves a tap room and a restaurant and a speakeasy and all these event support spaces that have culinary features, and the pool club, bar. And really, banks have been really interested, but not really receptive to the total deal structure and scale. It's a large deal, and when you take a package to a bank that says you're going to spend $36 million over 20 months, including the money we've already spent over the past couple of years in development, it becomes, again, a little bit of a scenario where virtually every bank is casting doubt, and then they're trying. So your solution there is to trying to find alternative methods to finance your deal. And I think a lot of people would have given up over the past 2 years, particularly with the number of hurdles and challenges we've seen, not only from the scale of the deal, but to the hurdles logistically in the facility. I mean, it's a 1938 building that has certain safety of life limitations that increase cost, and there's no functional plumbing, electrical, or heat and air anywhere in the facilities. So the amount of capital we have to spend to get it up to code and to get air flowing through the space and the lights on is fairly significant. And then you run into things like it being built in 1938 and street rights of way going through the building and having to replat the entire block and deal with, estates that have handed down ownership of certain parcels through 8 different estates since the teens, basically. And so been a lot of challenges, and the least, not the least of which is the fundraising and the capital and how you structurally put this deal together. And I think luckily I've got some historical background in tax credit work and historic preservation, and at least exposure to deals like that, and even participation in structuring some of those deals long ago. So I've got familiarity with it, although it's very dated, but it's been this kind of sink or swim reintroduction into the space. So
you do talk about having multiple sources. It's not just like coming from one place. I want to elaborate a little bit more on that. Like, as from like maybe like a new business trying to like get, funding and collecting from different sources. Like, how do you manage that? Like, what are some different avenues that you pursue?
For us, it's a little, it's strangely, I guess, a little simpler, but also more complicated. In the startup space, you're looking at equity funds, you're looking at seed funds, you're looking at friends and family, and a lot of kind of very nebulously defined sources of capital. And capital can come from anywhere. I mean, and it does come from everywhere. And for us, in this particular deal, we're not raising more equity. So that component of the capital stack just doesn't exist for us. We have cash on the books that we've been using for development expenses over the past couple of years. And we have a number of other sources of capital in this deal, but really in our deal, the economics don't work well. I mean, the structure, the mass, and the scale of everything is just not self-supporting really without a bunch of creative solutions. And so just like starting a business, whether you're looking at starting up and mortgaging your house or quitting your job, there's some sacrificial components. There are some lucky components, like you find somebody that's interested in this industry or concept and you find some equity in that source, and maybe you get somebody to guarantee some debt for you, or you lever some things with your retirement savings, whatever the case may be. For us, the structure is very multifaceted. It starts with a core foundation of a financial need, and then we look at, okay, what are we capable of debt servicing with these new concepts and with the appropriate reservations around, our financial forecast. We can't just go in and go, yeah, this hotel is going to sell 99% occupancy, 365 days a year at an ADR of, an average daily rate of $300. Well, those things aren't possible. So you go and you evaluate the market, you evaluate what you think you're capable of doing, and then you start applying sensitivities to it and really go, okay, well, what if I only hit 60% of my projected occupancy, or what if my ADR slips by $30 a night, and what's that impact? So you go through this sensitivity modeling that's, for us, pretty sophisticated and very granular, and we have really robust financial planning tools that we've developed over the past decade. But for startup businesses, a lot of times that's the biggest void of knowledge, is the financial side. And so I think for startups,
like, how would they find that knowledge? Yeah,
it's usually, it's hard to find that kind of knowledge base and or capability inherently in a third-party consultant or some source of knowledge like that. And a lot of times people are just winging it. I mean, I can't tell you, and when you sit down at OVF, you can probably see 20 entrepreneurs in the audience that have been successful, who really either had no clue what they were doing financially early on, they either winged it, or they were just lucky. And all three of those things happen in a combination, frankly, I think, in most startups. But I think for us, we're fairly lucky to have the institutional knowledge that we have amongst our leadership team and the work history and background to be able to assemble something this financially complicated. And again, after you're starting looking at sensitivities and looking at debt service, this thing involves historic preservation tax credits on the federal side, historic preservation tax credits on the state side. It involves a number of local and state incentive programs that assist in the viability of the project. And it also involves buy-in from a lot of different parties, whether it be the state, in the disposition of the asset, or it be the city. It's a number of agencies, with Department of Tourism, Department of Commerce, and frankly, everybody in the state, is really interested in this thing succeeding, because it does bring a really unique property and project and magnet over to the state capital area. So
Yeah, I'm really excited to see it get all finished. So I think it's definitely going to be a fun place to check out.
it'll definitely be where I probably spend the majority of the rest of my life.
Yeah, I would imagine. This is my blood, sweat, and tears have gone
Yeah.
into this. So on the subject of funding still, is there like any sources that like you think people should like be aware of, like new entrepreneurs that maybe they overlook or don't realize about?
I think the most overlooked sources of capital are industry relative, and not to say that there's not a lot of readily available institutional capital available around any individual industry, let's say. And there are sources like that. There are biomedical research, disease treatment, things like that. And there are focal points in oil and gas. But I think what people often fail to realize is the rate or the incidence of which practitioners in their own industries are interested in furthering other technologies or other startups in those industries. So, if you're in the telecom business and you've got a telecom solution, well, there are legitimately large telecom players in Oklahoma that don't have Bell at the end of their name or don't have Bell lineology to them. There are newer startups that are exercising really, they're extracting value out of federal regulations. And, finding someone who can use your technology in their business is oftentimes a great source of startup capital, because there's collusion's a bad term, but because it has a negative connotation to it. But, somebody who can utilize your technology to further their own business in effectively a selfish manner, that everybody's in that self-interest, basically with their own business.
Probably say more like collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think those kind of very nebulous sources of capital are often overlooked, and the resources and capability of players inside industries and the partnerships and funding capabilities. And they may not necessarily be significant day one, but when you have a player in the market that buys into your concept or your business or your execution, what you have subsequent to that is a story to tell that you have a player who has kind of additionally, in addition to investing in the deal, has corroborated the validity of the concept. And that goes a long way for, additional capital rounds or other sources of capital, particularly when you get into things that are more structured, whether they be a collective structured seed fund or, institutional money on the PE side or even on the venture side. When you're talking about bigger players and bigger offerings, that validation component, particularly where you've had third parties who are invested, is a big mover, I think, and a big opportunity that a lot of people miss out on.
That's good to
And
know.
a lot of people are always kind of immediately thinking, oh, well, this is a concept. I need $3.5 million to launch it. I just need to go find some VCs to fund the thing. Well, very early stage deals don't get funded by VCs typically. It's typically got, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars already in the cap stack and in the base and in the development of a project. And I think the other thing for entrepreneurs to understand is to really understand the technology commercialization process. And that was one of the things on the technology side. That was our biggest focus at I2E. And there's a really almost programmatic stepstone path to get technology introduced to market and to grow it. And without understanding that, and with having false expectations of what you're going to achieve or where you're going to get capital or where you're going to get validation, if you don't understand the necessary steps and the necessary accomplishments, frankly, that's where people, I think, often misstep as well.
What's great about doing business in Oklahoma?
Everything. I think for me, having lived in Oklahoma most of my life, with the exception of a few years, this is obviously home. So that's one of those things people often ask, well, why did you start a brewery in Oklahoma? Well, that's where I live and that's where I'm from. So that's the first answer. I think for people looking at Oklahoma outside the sphere, essentially, there are a lot of advantages to living elsewhere. First and foremost is cost of living. Secondly, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago with some people at the chamber, and Jonathan Stranger and I were sitting there talking about the historic evolution of the food and beverage business in Oklahoma City and in Oklahoma in general. And in that light, we were just talking about socially and culturally what Oklahoma has become over the past 20, 30 years versus what it was in the 80s. And one of the things that I often tell people is if they're not interested in Oklahoma City as a relocation alternative, or they're evaluating it versus a larger city or some other environment, I often challenge them to show me something that you can do in this bigger city that you can't do here that has a material impact on your life. You want to go to the LA Philharmonic, great. Well, you can go to the Civic Center. Is it the LA Philharmonic? No. But is seeing the Philharmonic in Oklahoma City versus seeing the LA Philharmonic, is that going to be like a detrimental impact to you or a material impact to you in the grand scheme of things when you have all these other positive things? You have a microcosm that has virtually no traffic. You have a city that is extremely progressive, both Oklahoma City and Tulsa, from a social investment standpoint and a capital investment standpoint. And business and society and culture follows dollars and investment. And if you're not putting resources and if you're not committed to growing the city culturally, then you're not going to make progress. You're not going to be able to recruit companies. You're not going to be able to recruit people. And I think, frankly, people are oftentimes, they tire of living in a big city, and if a big city doesn't fit your MO long term, this is the next greatest place. If you want to live in a big city for the rest of your life and you want to live in, DC, you want to live in Chicago, LA, then more power to you. But really at the end of the day, if that wears on you and you want to find a place to move, Oklahoma's got a lot of opportunity. And that's the other thing that I often tell entrepreneurs is that what you have the opportunity to do here is make a massive impact. You can be the big fish in this little pond, essentially, whereas if you take your startup business to the Valley, or you take it to Chicago, or you take it to Charlotte, you're a smaller player. Your capability on a grand scale, particularly in one given industry, may be the same, but your opportunity to participate in the community, which is another really valuable factor in Oklahoma City and Tulsa as well, and just the state in general, is that people are genuinely interested in being a part of the community. And that drives a little bit of social responsibility. It drives philanthropy. It drives just personal engagements amongst the leadership in the city. And you have the opportunity to make a big impact, whereas you don't necessarily have that in a lot of other cities or states.
For my last question, I'm just going to ask, is there anything you want to talk about, share, or discuss that we didn't touch upon that you've...
Oh, man. I think the one thing I will mention is a lot of people look at Oklahoma history and you look at the oil and gas concentration. There's been a lot of press recently over the past few years about Sam's book, Boomtown, and about this boom and bust cycle and our over-reliance on energy, things like that. I think all of those things are true, and a lot of the history speaks for itself, but we have built an over-reliance on energy at times, but I don't think people are always ready to step outside of that reliance and make risky investments and or make commitments that have long-term consequences and have long-term sight pictures. And so as a state, as we hopefully look to diversify the economy, that takes long-term investment, and it takes stepping away from some short-term gains with the oil and gas industry at times and ensuring that we don't get too tunnel visioned around this cash cow that is oil and gas. And so people talk about it all the time, but they're not always actively and they're not instrumentally engaged from a legislative process because they're either distracted or they're reliant or they're dependent on this. And so, stepping outside and allocating resources and funding to entities like OCAST and to the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance and other industries or other entities that actually serve the betterment and growth of Oklahoma-grown companies is really where the political apparatus starts to become real and where we see those tangible benefits over time. But it is a very long-term engagement, but it does take short-term investment, and it takes refocusing on things outside of oil and gas.
All right, well, thank you for your time. I appreciate everything you've told us today.
No problem. Glad to help, and we'll look forward to OVF in April.